Welcome to the virtual edition of Forever Changes. My name is Klaus Thymann, and I am the Danish contribution to this Scandinavian edition of climate change photography. I have 8 pieces in the show, and I chose to talk about climate change from a glacial perspective. You might think climate change has to do with CO2 and methane and greenhouse gases, and it does. But how to illustrate climate change is very difficult because you can't see those gases. But what you can see the change in glacier and glacier recession. So as you can hear, we're filming during COP, the climate conference, so the police is everywhere. So that's what's going on in the background. Anyway, so in order to illustrate climate change and show the invisible, make the invisible visible, I chose to use that illustrating climate change using glacier photography. Glaciers are key indicators of climate change because they only recede to long-term warming trends. Unlike wildfires, flooding, storms and hurricanes and so on, and other weather events that are part of the weather system, glacier recession only happens because of warming trends, long-term warming trends. And as such, that's a good way to illustrate climate change. As I said, there's 8 pieces in the show. And in my practice, I tend to do things and look at things in a global perspective. So I have actually been to all 6 populated continents. And we can look at each of the individual pieces. They all have a unique story. This piece is from Switzerland and is from 2009. It's shot on a Hasselblad medium format, so the classic square format, as you can see. What you see in the shot is the Findel Glacier, and you can actually see how the glacier has receded and left its trace in the mountain. You can see the line up there where the glacier used to be, so that's the volume of it, but it's also been a lot longer, so it used to be further down the valley. You can see the sediments that have been pushed down by the glacier. So it's quite obvious that climate change is showing up in the landscape. It's in Switzerland, and Switzerland is important because there's a Swiss body called the World Glacier Monitoring Service. They collect data from all the national respondents, so all the national bodies that collect glacier data. How do you collect glacier data? Well, there's 3 ways of doing that. One is to use satellite photography. But satellite photography only goes so far back, maybe the 70s if we're lucky. Then there's, and that's called remote sensing. Then there's the good old-fashioned way, and that is to go up to the glacier, see what the front line is, mark that, and then also put a stick in the glacier and see how much snow either accumulates or melt during the melt season or the accumulation season. So that's what's happening in this shot. I obviously trekked around to find a good vantage point, and then was waiting quite long for the clouds to be in the perfect position so you could actually see the mountain, but including the top. So that's what's going on here. This work is from Uganda in Africa. There's 3 countries in Africa with glaciers: Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Glaciers form where it's cold enough for ice to be permanently. So either you go towards the pole when it gets cold, or you go up with altitude, and then you also have glaciers forming. The mountains, the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda are bordering Congo, and some of the peaks are up to 5,000 meters. With altitude, you get snowfall and you get ice accumulating. But with temperatures rising, the snow line and the ice line creeps up. You can actually see in this image how the glacier used to go all the way down the mountain, and now there's just a little bit left. This is the Speke Glacier in Uganda. It's very, very close to equator, so you have harsh sun, but you also have a lot of UV light coming in. That's why the vegetation is as otherworldly as it is. You have these plants that grow, and it really looks like a different planet. It's extremely picturesque. Uganda and the Rwenzori Mountains in particular, are bordering Congo DRC. And because of armed conflict, not a lot of people have visited this area. And when I went there, I was tracing old paths and trekking routes that haven't been used for like 70 years. So it was a bit of a mission. This piece is from Greenland from 2012. And Greenland was disputed in the way that up until the Second World War, both Denmark and Norway were kind of claiming it as claiming territorial rights. And in order to claim the territorial rights, they were surveying the island. They were conducting flights and taking photographs around the edges of Greenland to see where they could maybe provide landing strips, where the landscape was flat enough to get a landing strip for an airport, and so on and so on. Then came the Second World War. And those aerial photographs were proven quite popular for the armed forces, and Greenland became a geopolitical important country because it kind of linked North America and Europe. Those photographs, those aerial reconnaissance photographs from, I think they were from 1933, were stored in some asbestos-filled warehouse in Copenhagen. And when it was renovated, they resurfaced. With those aerial photographs, I went back and retraced what change looked like. So found the position in a helicopter, opened the door, and pointed out my camera to see what had changed. It's incredibly difficult to understand the scale here, because when you look at mountains without vegetation and ice, it's almost like a fractal experience. You can zoom in and you get the different shapes and patterns repeating themselves. So it's very, very difficult to understand the scale. Across, I think it's more than 2 kilometers across the front here. The glacier wall is between 50 and 70 meters. It's absolutely massive. And when you understand that, and when you're there in person, it's very difficult to convey in a photograph. But when you are there in person, you feel humbled and you really understand what a catastrophe we're creating here with to the planet, because we are changing things on a planetary scale. So that's what's happening here. It's really a witness to the climate change unfolding. When you look at the image, you can also see a ridge line just faint here in the shadow, and the ice used to come all the way up there. So when you read the news or hear news about the volume of ice disappearing from Greenland, that's what it looks like in reality. This is the climate crisis unfolding. Mapping is part of my practice. I go to places that are not necessarily on the map. And why mapping? Well, before we can actually understand something, we have to first map it. It sounds obvious, but there are white spots on the map. The shot we looked at earlier from Uganda wasn't really on the map. You know, we say white spots on the map, and that refers to the places where we hadn't actually allocated and mapped things in historic times, because the paper would go through. Now there's very few white spots on the map in that sense. We have satellites covering the globe. However, with approximately, and we don't actually really know, with approximately 300,000 glaciers around the globe, not all of them are being surveyed, let alone have been named. This one here is far, far up a valley in the Himalayas in Nepal. And the glacier you see here hasn't been named. So I conducted a mission in 2012 to go up and see what that looked like, and to create a visual documentation before it changes drastically. And I was sleeping in there that night. I think it's around 5,500 meters above sea level, so fairly cold. And we had this drizzle of snow during the night, and the whole landscape turned into this picturesque, beautiful thing with a little bit of cloud, and it's almost monochrome, but there is actually color in there, but you hardly see it. This is a shot from inside a glacier. It's photographed from inside the Pallantollen in Sweden. It's the area of Kebnekaise, which is the highest point in Sweden. It's in the Arctic, and this tunnel, there's historic records of it forming in the 1940s. And then for a very long time, there was no tunnel, there was just a glacier. And then in 2011, it started forming again for a few years. So I launched an expedition in 2013 to go up and see what it looked like. The glacier, what happens, you have the glacier here, and then when it melts, meltwater can run underneath it. With that comes a little tunnel, hot air comes up, and the glacier melts from the inside, and that will form a tunnel. Next year it might snow, and you can see the fresh snow here that has accumulated. And with that accumulation of snow, you'll get snow coming in, but the next year, that snow will melt away quicker than the compacted ice, and then the tunnel might get bigger. Depending on what happens and the amount of snow and the weather, the tunnel will change from year to year. It's very dynamic. But the tunnel doesn't form anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. So this is in a history into what things used to look like. You can also see the year lines in the glacier, because you have the melt and you have the top layer that would have formed. So you see these lines here where you have where the glacier would have formed. This image here is from New Zealand. It's from the southern island of New Zealand, and there's quite a few glaciers there. What is very interesting here is, and I think I mentioned earlier, there's about 300,000 glaciers in the world. There's 2 that connects with rainforest. Not tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest. So you can see the tree ferns, you can see the vegetation, and then the glacier used to come down all the way down to the tree line and actually push up the trees. You can see what's happening here. The glacier used to cover that area, and it's the Fox Glacier is the name of it. It's been retreating quite a bit now. It's retreating a lot because the glaciers in New Zealand are quite long, and with the temperature changing, the freezing point goes upwards. But if you go a little bit up, you go a lot in. So they're retreating a lot back inland. It's very, very beautiful. It's very stunning. And I actually, in order to create this shot, I did something that I've only do a few times, but I actually plated it together because I didn't want to shoot with a very wide angle that would distort the landscape. So I plated it together to get this vantage point. It looks kind of realistic when you look at it. It has the same viewpoint. It has the same kind of focal length on the lens I use. In general, I try to use a lens that doesn't distort when you look at it from a human perspective, so not too wide, and give you a kind of true representation of what the natural landscape look like. Doing landscape photography obviously looks really simple, but finding the right spot and going to the right area, and then obviously waiting a long time sometimes for consistent light and stuff is quite painstakingly. But it's interesting to look at this one. I like it a lot, and it's not so often you get this kind of contrast between vegetation and the glacier. Here we're in South America, in Bolivia, and in Bolivia the glaciers are receding at alarming rates. Why is that important? Well, glaciers are important for a number of reasons. A lot of people rely on meltwater for irrigation and for drinking water and for their livelihoods. Glaciers are a little bit like water reservoirs in the sense that they would accumulate snow, and then when you have a dry season, they melt, and then they make sure that the river flow is constant throughout the year. So for me, this image is about showing the dynamic of the glacier and the ice, and showing that it actually has a huge human impact. There's about 1 billion people relying on glacier melt runoff worldwide. That's 1 billion people. That's a hell of a lot of people, where you turn on the tap and if the glaciers are gone, then nothing comes out. Very dramatically speaking, but essentially that is the consequence of climate change. So you can see this is from La Paz, and it's Illuminati Glacier in the background, and you have La Paz in the foreground. And I obviously went there and then waited to just the right time after sunset, and you have dusk, and you have no sunlight coming in, but the kind of fade and reflection into the sky hitting the mountain. Then you have the glow of the city as well. So it's a very good time of day to photograph, I find. Well, because it's that kind of halfway magical thing, the magic hours we call it sometimes, because it looks very beautiful. So with that, I will leave it and thank you for listening. And you know, if you can't come here and look at it in real life, at least you had experienced this. And then don't forget that you can make a change as well. Project Pressure, which is the website is linked here. We have launched a petition, and you can make your voice heard and contribute to being a solution around climate change. Thank you.